Welcome everybody to our continued look at the Industrial Revolution. Last week we talked about the origins of the Industrial Revolution and some of its impact. In particular, we looked at factory work. Today I'm going to be talking a little about some of the ways in which in Industrial Revolution era Britain we see a clamping down, an attempt to control working people. A process sometimes known as discipline and punish, in the words of the French writer Michel Foucault. The ideas of Thomas Malthus, who believed that population, in particular the population of the poor, was out of control, and indeed it was not only impossible but a bad idea to help the poor because they would only live to breed and create more poor people, is seen in a hardening of attitudes against the poor. One result of this was the Poor Law Amendment Act in Great Britain in 1832, which led to the workhouse. Now, you may have heard of the workhouse from the works of Charles Dickens, or perhaps more likely TV and film adaptations of Charles Dickens's work. Poor people entered the workhouse and were forced to work in return for what little food and shelter they were given. They were segregated by sex. Here you see the women. Families were split up. Women, children, men sent to different sections of the workhouse. Here women are working on various improving jobs. The ideology behind the workhouse was that not only was it unpleasant, you were not meant to be encouraged to live off the state, you were meant to work hard for what little you got if you were poor, but also you were meant to be productive. The idea was that these lazy, shiftless poor people were supposed to learn through hard work how to be productive members of society. Another aspect of this discipline and punish process was reforms of prisons. This is an image of a 19th century prison in Boston, which today has been converted into a hotel called, ironically, Liberty Hotel. Ironically, these 19th century prisons were very well constructed. Everybody had an individual cell, making them ideal to be converted into hotels, individual rooms that can easily be locked. The dominant feature of this prison is this central tower from which all of the prisoners could be constantly surveilled, constantly watched. The design of these prisons is sometimes called a panopticon, a Greek word meaning all-seeing. Everybody could be seen all of the day by the guards, in particular for the central control house. The prisoners were given a daily regiment of hard work, prayer in the chapel, and isolation from one another. The individual cells were put there not for comfort, but so that prisoners would not mix with one another. They were not even meant to see one another's faces, hence this hood which was placed on the prisoners whenever they were let out of their cells for exercise, for work, or in the chapel where they were in separate booths so they could not talk to one another, subjected to preaching in the hope that they would be reformed people. This life was very hard. It was effectively solitary confinement 24/7, not allowed to speak to your fellow prisoner for fear that you would be corrupted by contact with him. Ironically, this and the workhouse were implemented by people who seemed to have genuinely believed they had the interests of the poor at heart. They were based on a belief that prisoners, the criminal classes, could be reformed given doses of hard work and Christianity. A belief that unemployed people who were seen not as victims of society but as lazy people could be turned into hard-working, honest members of the community. Another aspect of the discipline and punish attitude of the 19th century was the rise of the insane asylum. Again, this was driven by a spirit which in some ways was highly optimistic, a spirit that the old asylums, when people were basically chained to walls, could be replaced by modern scientific asylums for the mentally ill. The problem with these asylums is that admission was often based on what to us would seem very arbitrary grounds. In particular, women were admitted to these asylums, leading to many historians to argue that asylums were there not for the treatment of mental illness, but for the incarceration of women. It's sometimes said prison was for men, the asylum for women. And this list of reasons for admission to asylums in the late 19th century includes, to us, rather humorous causes. The compiler of this list has highlighted novel reading as a cause of incarceration. Behind this was the idea that women were weaker, mentally and spiritually and physically, more likely to have the balance of their minds disturbed by for example, reading exciting and titillating details in modern novels, in suffering from tobacco and masturbation, politics, religious enthusiasm. All of these ideas carry with them the idea that women were weak-minded and also suspiciously sexual. Behind the 19th century idea of female sexual purity was a terror among men that women, with their dangerous sexuality, might threaten social order and therefore needed to be incarcerated if their delicate little feminine minds were upset by reading exciting novels or by seduction and disappointment, or my favourite, suppression of menses and uterine derangement. Hysteria, which was often a generic term for all sorts of mental illnesses, again reveals the sexist underpinnings of these ideas. Hysteria is related to this idea of uterine derangement. Both of them are based on the uterus, or in Greek the hysteria, the woman's womb, and is believed that disturbances of the lady parts would lead to all sorts of moral and spiritual and mental disturbance. From the happy subject of insanity, imprisonment and the workhouse, we'll move next time to looking at working class organisation. We've talked a lot about the horrors of the Industrial Revolution. Last week we looked at the world of the factories. Today I introduced some of the controlling practices of that discipline and punish idea. Next time we'll look at the rise of labour unions, the rise of working class organisation, and some aspects of working class culture in the 19th century. Before we do that, continue reading the relevant chapter in the book and to the source readings that I've uploaded onto eLearning, and that will be the basis for our discussion board this week. Thank you all and have a good week.